He makes a better deal when he uses me, like everybody else. And one of the reasons I respect Paul Manafort so much is he went through that trial. You know, they make up stories. People make up stories. This whole thing about flipping, they call it. I know all about flipping. For 30, 40 years, I've been watching flippers. Everything's wonderful, and then they get 10 years in jail, and they flip on whoever the next highest one is, or as high as you can go. It almost ought to be outlawed. It's not fair. Because if somebody's going to spend 5 years like Michael Cohen, or 10 years or 15 years in jail because of a taxi cab industry, because he defrauded some bank, the last two were the tiny ones. You know, campaign violations are considered not a big deal, frankly. But if somebody defrauded a bank and he's going to get 10 years in jail or 20 years in jail, but if you can say something bad about Donald Trump and you'll go down to 2 years or 3 years, which is the deal he made, in all fairness to him, most people are going to do that. And I've seen it many times. I've had many friends involved in this stuff. It's called flipping, and it almost ought to be illegal.
Wow. Wow. Benjamin Wittes, we will let you stew on that a little bit and get right back to you. John Podhoretz, yes. President Trump is reportedly considering a pardon for Paul Manafort, using a similar rationale that's been floated for why top Trump campaign officials met with Russians at Trump Tower in 2016. That defense is everybody does it. Take a look.
I have great respect for what he's done in terms of what he's gone through. You know, he worked for Ronald Reagan for years. He worked for Bob Dole. He worked, I guess his firm worked for McCain. He worked for many, many people, many, many years. And I would say what he did, some of the charges they threw against him, every consultant, every lobbyist in Washington probably does.
According to Fox News, the president reportedly said that he would consider pardoning Manafort. The former head of the Trump campaign was convicted on Tuesday on 8 counts of bank and tax fraud, as well as failing to disclose foreign bank accounts. The president spent part of the day yesterday railing against the outcome of Manafort's trial and the jury being unable to reach a verdict on 10 of the other counts against him. He wrote on Twitter, the president, a large number of counts, 10, could not even be decided in the Paul Manafort case. Witch hunt! But we now know a single juror held out on convicting Manafort on all 18 charges. Trump added, I feel very badly for Paul Manafort and his wonderful family. Justice took a 12-year-old tax case, among other things, applied tremendous pressure on him, and unlike Cohen, he refused to make up stories in order to get a deal. Such respect for a brave man. Following the president's tweets, the White House disputed that he was planning on pardoning Manafort.
The Manafort case doesn't have anything to do with the president, doesn't have anything to do with his campaign, it doesn't have anything to do with the White House.
Even if it has nothing to do with the president, he still could have the power to pardon Mr. Manafort. Is that something that he's begun discussing with the team? Has he ruled it out? Does it come up? And
I'm not aware of any conversations regarding that at all.
Thanks. The question that I also
other than actually when he was asked by a news outlet earlier this week, and he said that he hadn't been thinking about that at all.
One of the more useless moments of the day would be the White House press briefing every single day. So, John Podhoretz, yes. The concept of potentially pardoning Manafort and flipping should be outlawed. Go.
Okay. So he is the, as the head of the executive branch, he is the chief criminal justice officer in the United States. And you just heard the President of the United States say that one of the key ways in which you uncover criminal conspiratorial action, which is to put pressure on a defendant to give up other people who were involved in that conspiracy, should be outlawed. So let's just think about that for a minute. That's number one. Number two is what he's doing to Manafort is, people are always analogizing everything to The Godfather, but in The Godfather Part 2, there's this famous thing where Frankie Five Angels is going to testify against the Corleone family, and they go and get his brother from Sicily to sit in the courtroom to shame him into not testifying because that would be dishonorable. This is Trump saying to Manafort, don't break, don't flip. I respect you. You're wonderful. What a great guy. Love your family. Don't break. And I guess in there is the hint that he might pardon him.
By the way, I thought that Godfather analogy, I thought that they were going to kill the brother, not that he was ashamed, and that was the reason.
Yeah.
This guy's. But what I find amazing about Trump, Mr. Strength and Mr. Bravery, is he would be the first human being in the history of human beings that would flip on anybody to save himself. I actually believe that even if it came to his children, he would send his children to jail before he would go to jail. I think he's that level, that depraved, and that empty of any moral center. So I love that he sits there and talks about the weakness and the breaking point. Stunning.
All right, so I want to hear from Sam and Caddy on the Republicans. At what point do they break, and is it a pardon? But first, Benjamin Wittes, is a pardon possible? And what are the legal avenues anyone could take if that happens?
A pardon is certainly possible. The president's power to pardon people for federal offenses is essentially unrestricted. And Paul Manafort has now convictions and a trial coming up, and all of those charges are charges on which the president could theoretically pardon him. I think we have to reflect. I want to sort of amplify a point that John just made. You know, the president is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. He's the executive officer. He takes an oath to preserve and protect the Constitution and to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And you just showed a whole bunch of clips of him encouraging somebody not to cooperate with a lawful federal investigation in which he has personal interests. And I just think that is worth pausing over. Because he is such a peculiar figure, we treat it as this comical thing and talk about it in terms of the Godfather and whatever. This is the president of the United States who went on television yesterday and talked disparagingly about the idea of cooperating with federal law enforcement. That should shock people.
I mean,
that's
an impeachable offense. I mean, if you actually think about it, in a series of articles of impeachment, the idea that the president would knowingly advocate impeding federal investigations could be viewed as a high crime and misdemeanor, as a violation of his constitutional oath.
The only flipping that's going on is the president. He's like a fish on a hot, dry dock, flipping around trying to get water. That's the flipping that's going on right now. And he ain't going back into the water. I don't know how this ends, but I'll tell you right now, the walls appear to be closing in. The question for Sam, Caddy, and Eddie after the break will be about the Republicans and if the pardon is a bridge too far for this president and for them in terms of their support for him. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.